everyone, welcome back to my channel. So this is a book review for Calling the Shots, Sue Barker, Calling the Shots, My Autobiography by Sue Barker with Sarah Edworthy from 2022. So since it's Wimbledon time, currently on in the background as we speak, I thought I would read a tennis book, seeing as I'm trying to be sort of seasonal about my reading this year. And I haven't been able to find any good looking tennis themed murder mysteries, which would be fantastic. So I thought it would be my non-fiction read for July, a tennis player autobiography. And there were a couple that popped up that I was looking at, and then I managed to find this quite recent autobiography of Sue Barker, or by Sue Barker, at a reduced price on World of Books. I didn't actually realise that it was a hardback copy because it was only a few quid, so quite a deal. So Sue Barker was a professional tennis player in the 1970s when the women's tour had only just really separated from the men's, and so that was quite an interesting time in women's tennis. She won the French Open, she was number 3 in the world, and then after retiring in the early 80s she began a very successful television career. So she's hosted or presented several Olympic Games. She did host, or was the host presenter of Wimbledon at the time of writing this book, for 30 years, and then she has since retired from that. And then she was also the host, quizmaster person on Question of Sport for quite a long time as well. So it became apparent very early on in my reading of this book that I was not going to think that this was a very good book. I wasn't going to think it was a very well written book or particularly interesting book. She really seems to want to like gloss over a lot of the more negative or potentially controversial things, but which would have made it more interesting. But there was a few other things that few other ideas that kind of came into my mind as I was reading the book. So the first one is probably a question or an issue for all autobiographies, is how well does the reader know the author / celebrity? So how well does the reader know who Sue Barker is and what she's done in her career? You'd have to assume reasonably well. I mean, if you're going to pick up an autobiography of somebody, you'd have to assume that you have some interest in them, that you like them, that you're kind of poised to think favourably of them, but also that you do know a little bit about them as well. But if you knew everything, then why would you be reading the book? So there's obviously going to be gaps in your knowledge, and presumably that would be more the personal side of things. But I suppose the question for the author is, how much of that more boring, factual information do you put in? When do you put it in, and how do you make it sound kind of natural? Because it's slightly different if it's a biography, because you're writing about somebody. It doesn't have to sound quite as natural as an autobiography, which I guess is supposed to sound like you're having almost a conversation with the person writing the book, or like it's a little bit more personal. Reading the book, it's like every so often she sort of remembered that she needed to sort of fill us in on some of the achievements of her career, and then so she just kind of dumps some facts about things that she'd achieved, which then just sounds like weirdly boastful, and I don't know, it just was a bit jarring. But then I suppose it is an autobiography, so obviously you do have to put in, you do have to put in your achievements and things that you've done, and that's the whole point of why you are a person with an autobiography, unlike me, who obviously is never gonna write an autobiography that gets published anyway. So I don't know, it just didn't quite work for me. And honestly, I think what would make a lot more sense for autobiographies is just a little bit at the beginning, a little bio summary at the front, which just gives us a bit of a rough timeline of the key events, successes and achievements in that person's life or career. Basically like I did at the beginning of the review. I think that would work better, because then you don't have to like try and shoehorn that in throughout the book as well, and also make it try and sound natural. Another thing that I was thinking when I read the book was that it suffers from being both too vague at times, but also too specific at times. I think the specificity, the being too specific, serves the purpose of, one, perhaps making you feel more like you're actually there, so you can actually visualise what was happening, which might make it a bit more real to the reader. and two, making it seem more believable, or making it seem more like the author must be telling the truth, because why would they make up a lie and include so much detail in it? Not that I thought for a second that anything in this book was a lie or intentionally factually untrue, but it's like when you're reading the book, you get this strong sense that someone who's writing the book really wants you to believe that it's true, and it's a bit odd. So as an example, there just is in one of the chapters where she says, I was staying with my friend from my junior days, her junior tennis playing days, from my junior days, Linda Mottram, in her family home in a Wimbledon cul-de-sac. Did we need to know that she lived in a Wimbledon cul-de-sac? Like, what purpose did that serve? Did it add anything to that sentence or that paragraph, or what the rest of the chapter was about? Not really, but it's like lots of these little extra details are like peppered in. She also mentions at one point that Bjorn Borg, a very famous tennis player of the time who was always mobbed by fans, would be walking around wearing his orange Fila tracksuit. Do we need to know that it was a Fila tracksuit? Is that important? I guess it adds detail that perhaps we don't know, that we can get from reading the book, but it just seemed like there were these odd little extra bits that we didn't really need, and it's just kind of jarring. And then there are some of the things that are kind of vague. So she talks a lot about her coach, who she worked with for 19 years, and the whole first chapter is about him. That makes sense. But the way that she describes him, I mean, she says about him, amongst other things, that he had exacting standards and there were tears along the way, but he always wanted the best for me. I mean, well, that doesn't really tell us anything, does it? I mean, what were his exacting standards, and what were the tears caused by, and how do you know he wanted the best for you? There are some incidents that she gives in more detail which kind of back that up, but in that particular part of the chapter, in that first chapter, which is all about her coach, I don't know, that it just seemed like a bit vague, like, oh, he was very tough on me, but he loved me, he always supported me. Like, well, what? Like, you're not really telling me anything about him. And he was a very important figure in her life and her career for a long time. And then there were, like I said, times when it just really felt like she really wanted to kind of gloss over or move on from anything that could be negative or controversial. So she left the UK when she became a professional tennis player when she was about 18 years old, and went to America, and that was, she says clearly in the book, to avoid paying the higher tax bracket in the UK. The women's tour at the time was the Virginia Slims tour, so it was sponsored by Virginia Slims, which is a cigarette company. I don't think you would get away with that today. And then also she describes in one chapter about her childhood what I think of as being a traumatizing event in a young person's life, and she sort of positions it as indicating that she was born as a fighter, so really like positions it in a more positive way. And I don't know, it just seemed like there were interesting stories in there that were not really explored, because they would have been perhaps a bit more complicated to go into. But then perhaps she just wanted to focus on the more personal anecdotes about her experience in her life and not talk about the Virginia Slims cigarette sponsor. Another theme that I thought of throughout the book, or another issue that I had throughout the book, was I felt like it was oddly structured. Basically, it's chronological, but then still somehow kind of confusing as to where we are in time. The book is kind of split really into three sections. So one is her childhood and her junior tennis playing career, then one is her professional tennis playing career, and then after that is her television career after she's retired from tennis. But within those sections it's kind of messy, especially her tennis career and also her junior tennis playing as well. Because it was then kind of split up thematically, so like a chapter on her coach, a chapter on her family, a chapter about Wimbledon. But her coach, family and Wimbledon also appear in multiple other chapters, not surprisingly. So they were kind of moving back and forwards in time within the same chapter in a way that my brain just couldn't keep track of. That could have just been me, but I really could have done with like a timeline at the top just to tell me what year we were in, or what tournament she was playing at the time, I think, to be fair, she does try to put the events into a context by referencing other events that have happened. So this was when I just won that match against that Billie Jean King, or this was when I had just, you know, lost this match, or this was when I just had this success. And it's things that she's already referenced in the book, but that just makes me realise that we've moved forward and backward in time a few times, and I'm just thinking, how old were you here? Like, what, like, it confused me more. And it's hard to find an example because I feel like the examples are kind of spread across multiple chapters. And I would just be reading half the book basically. But I don't know, I just didn't find like it flowed in a way that my brain could understand. It kind of felt like Sue Barker had told some of these events to somebody else, and they had been tasked with putting the book together in a cohesive way, and it hadn't quite worked. Which does bring me to my next section. So this book is co-written. It's co-written between Sue Barker and someone called Sarah Edworthy. So Sue Barker seems reasonably smart and she can probably string a few sentences together. So why did she need Sarah Edworthy and what did she do? Well, I don't fully know, but a quick Google of Sarah Edworthy tells me that she's a journalist and also written numerous books. She's written, clearly has an interest in sports. She's written with the Formula One driver Jenson Button. She's written with a rugby player Ben Cohen. She's written with the runner Joe Pavey, like co-written books with them. Or, yeah, I think it all says co-wrote books. She's also written some books about the Olympics, and she's also written for Wimbledon.com and also RolandGarros.com, which is the French Open website, I guess. I'm still wondering like how involved she was and how much of the book she wrote. I don't have like a big issue with people having co-authors or even ghostwriters. I do find it a bit odd when it's an autobiography because isn't it supposed to be in your own words? But I can see what the potential benefits would be if you have very little experience with writing. I would have thought the main benefit of having an experienced co-author is that they can help you to structure your ideas better. But as previously mentioned, I did find this book a little bit all over the place at times. So I don't know. At the end of the book, there is the thank yous. So Sue Barker gives her thank yous to the usual friends, family, co-workers, people that supported her. And Sue Barker does also thank Sarah Edworthy for her detective work and patience and other stuff. And then Sarah Edworthy gives her thank yous, which do include people like former tennis player Billie Jean King, former tennis player Tim Henman, presenter Claire Baldwin, and former rugby player and now presenter guy Matt Dawson, who was on Question of Sport with Sue Barker. So people that have known and worked with Sue Barker. And she thanks them for giving their time and observations, giving their time to share memories and their observations of Sue Barker's life, I guess, and her career. Both these things put together makes it sound like she was going around to tea with all of Sue Barker's friends and to like dig up anecdotes for the book, which doesn't actually answer the question of like who wrote them and who wrote it into the book, but it does seem a bit odd to me that you would need somebody else to dig up stories of your life. So, were there any good bits? Well, the best bits obviously were the dishing the dirt, the spilling the tea, of which there should have been more. So, mainly her brief relationship with Cliff Richard, which I didn't know much about other than that they had dated, but it sounds like it was actually very brief and she describes it more as a romantic friendship. Then he ghosted her and dumped her while she was struggling with an injury, and then she moved on, she got married, and I didn't even know she's been married for like 30 plus years anyway, and she is annoyed at Cliff because he still talks about their relationship to the press. Sounds like a bit of a jerk. Also, the BBC do not cover themselves in glory, and she does go into detail about protracted and unprofessional like contract renegotiations and basically times when they've tried to fire her and then like backtracked, I guess, when they realised that they didn't have anyone else to replace her. So things like they'd taken her off various sports. They didn't want her to present the 2012 Olympics, the London Olympics, but then a few weeks before the Olympic Games was due to begin, she got pulled into doing it with Gary Lineker. I think she wanted to do it, it's just that they had spent a lot of time telling her that she wasn't going to, and then at the last minute they were like, oh no, actually we need you. And then also her protracted firing from Question of Sport, which seemed to drag on for several years, I think probably because they just didn't really know what else to do with the format and, you know, who to replace it with. So yeah, I mean, she goes into a lot of detail about that, and that was very easy to understand, unlike some of the other sort of more tennis stuff. And it's interesting that I would have expected more about the tennis side of things. So now I'm thinking, I'm quite interested in how the women's tour was in the early 1970s when it first separated from the men. I'm a bit confused because they separated from the men because they were really being like shortchanged. They were getting paid less, they had just less of everything, less respect, less, you know, I guess TV coverage, and but it just sounds like they were still getting paid less, and they still had worse time slots, and they still had less support even once the tour kind of separated. So I would be interested to know like why the women's tour separated from the men's and what the benefit of that was, because it sounds like they were still playing in the tournaments together at the same time. I think it was quite a different experience then than it is now. Not that I know what it's like now personally, but I think that interests me more, and perhaps I need to read a Billie Jean King autobiography, because maybe she'll go into more detail about that. But this might become like, I don't think I necessarily want to read another tennis autobiography right now, but this might become like my annual tradition, and I'll read a tennis book, a tennis player's autobiography every year at Wimbledon. So it hasn't put me off them. I would just say that, you know, whatever the full price was, £20 for this hardback would have not been the best £20 you've ever spent. So that is Calling the Shots by Sue Barker and Sarah Edworthy. That's my review. Let me know what you think in the comments, and give me a like and a subscribe.